Today's topic that I'm going to discuss with you, I'm going to provide 7 tips for implementing a reliable framework design. So the learning objectives that I want to discuss today is hopefully after this short presentation, because I'm only going to take about 20 minutes and then we'll be providing some questions and some Q&A. But I want to go over the fundamentals of a successful automation framework, the value of an automation framework. So what are the benefits, especially relative to DevOps and CI/CD? And then I'm going to share with you 7 very specific tips to design and implement an automation framework in a DevOps or a CI/CD environment. So when you think about it, a well-designed framework, what does that, what are the benefits exactly? Well, it decreases the automated test development time significantly. It also enables tests to be created sooner. So one of the fantastic things about an automation framework, a robust automation framework, is that it actually allows you to start creating automated tests even before the UI is developed. So as long as you've got collaboration with development and you understand and know the description of an object and the functionality, you can actually start creating your automated test, again, before the UI is ever developed. So that's incredible. It decreases maintenance. It increases test automation coverage. So in other words, by coverage, what I mean is you are going to be able to validate a significantly greater number of conditions, scenarios, requirements, etc. And then the last bullet, you don't want to take this benefit lightly. It puts the power of automation in more hands. So one of the great things is that you've got this automation engine in the background that perhaps your automation engineers have developed, but then you've got your SMEs, your SMEs, your subject matter experts that can actually develop the automated test using the front end. So those that are less technical, and I don't mean that in a negative way, can actually start creating automated tests. So the characteristics of a robust automation framework. It's got to have modular code. So there should be no duplication of code, nothing redundant. It's got to be scalable. Face it, let me ask all of you, how many of you know of an organization or in an organization where you've only got one application to test, to validate? I would be absolutely shocked if any of you were there virtually raising your hand. So it's got to be scalable. Little effort should be required to add business processes or new applications under test to the framework. It must address error handling. So all unexpected application errors are managed by using exception handlers. It's got to be reliable, and the data must be separated from the code. It's got to be managed externally. So these are all some key characteristics of a robust automation framework. So some common elements that I want to discuss. And we're just going to go over the fundamental components quickly, and then we'll dive into more detailed descriptions afterwards, and then I'll get into the design tips. But it's got to have a simple front end. So that is one of the common elements. And you'll notice in the visual here, if that looks like an Excel spreadsheet, it's because that's exactly what it is. So that's how simple the front end can be, and that provides benefits. It decreases the learning curve. A second element, as well as the sub-elements, if you will, is a maintainable back end. So the back end would be made up of a master driver, application drivers, and business process drivers. And I'm not going to really talk about actions, but keep in mind that there are more granular actions involved in your framework, but I'm not including those really as an element. And then the third element is the data. So the data which is actually entered into that simple front end, input data, validation data, etc. So the front end. So you can certainly utilize something other than a spreadsheet, but something that our organization has done quite successfully for many firms is we've implemented a robust framework using Microsoft Excel as the front end. So in this diagram that you see here, each column represents a test step. So you'll notice, for example, that the click register button, each cell would represent a step in the iteration of that instance where it would either check or uncheck that register button. Each record in our spreadsheet represents a test iteration. Each tab represents a business process. So you'll see that we've got our application under test login. So that login sheet represents the business process, obviously, of logging in. So as you can see, very intuitive. The AUT registration would be exactly that. Each business process tab contains all of the necessary parameters to create both positive and negative test. So very robust. And then output is captured to output parameters. So you would have columns in your spreadsheet defined as output parameters, and you can use output parameters to write values and customize your reports, or even much more likely, to utilize those values written in subsequent iterations. So the great benefit of such a framework and such a front end is that multiple applications under test can be incorporated simply by adding tabs associated with other AUTs. So perhaps we've got a new process coming down the road where it's going to be drop class. Then all we would have to do is add a tab, which would, again, represent a business process, for that drop class functionality. In the front end, a master Excel template contains all the business processes for a given application. To create a new test, a tester would simply save the master template as another file, remove the tabs not required for the test, and reorder in the order they will execute, then they apply the data. So the key thing here, the only minor challenge, is just make sure that you keep your master template pristine, maybe even keep it under lock and key. So let me share with you an example of the data flow relative to the front end and our drivers, the back end. So we've got our input file. So you'll notice there we've got our business process tabs, we've got our columns, we've got our different rows. And this file would then get fed in, if you will, into our master driver. And then that master driver would then ask, well, which file do I process? And it would process those passed in either by the master driver, or if you're utilizing Micro Focus's ALM or Quality Center, then you would define the input files in that solution. Then the application, the master driver, would then ask, well, which app driver do I call? Well, it would call this one. So notice that I'm pointing to AUT. So in our master driver, there would be logic or code, if you will, that would evaluate the business process tab name and utilize that to determine which application driver gets called. Then the application driver will say, well, which business process driver do I call? Well, this one, the login, because again, it's evaluating, the logic is evaluating the name of the business process tab. The driver would then ask, well, which action do I call to compare results? So perhaps we get to a point in our business process driver and the logic there where there's actually, it's going to grab the actual results and it wants to now compare it to the defined expected results. Which action does it call to do that comparison? Well, perhaps we have logic in our code which determines that if a column is preceded or has a naming convention of expected underscore, it knows to call our function or our action of compare. So a few framework design tips that I want to share with you. So this applies to your entire framework. It is critical that you know your users, understand your audience, the customer, those that will be using the framework. Are they technical enough to understand objects, as well as classes and methods? So these are some questions that you've got to determine. If not, then you need to expect and build into the process, into your schedule, time to train them on the different concepts in order for them to be able to use the framework. You want to design it to handle everything in the background. When it comes to your users, do they understand test automation methodology? Or you might even ask, should they have to in order to use our framework? Can they be trained on how to use the framework to create automated tests in 8 hours or less? That's just a great, rule of thumb that we typically utilize. It's very beneficial to use an input method that everyone in your audience understands. So as I mentioned, that's why we tend to use Excel a lot, but you can certainly use an XML file. You can use a database input as well. Tip number 2, make sure that you document and communicate all standards. So the rules or the syntax required to create the automated test, those need to be easily understood and conveyed. Because if the learning curve is too difficult, it will go by the wayside, and we all know what happens then. It becomes shelfware. So remember, multiple applications and even multiple platforms must be taken into consideration.
So that you know the scope and expectation of automation within your organization with the leadership. Because if it's designed solely to work on web apps using IE, well, what about cross-browser testing? What about SAP or Oracle or some other ERP system? And what about legacy apps that might use VB and ActiveX, things like that? So it is absolutely essential that you know the scope and expectations of leadership within your organization. So on the next slide, I'm going to target specifically a couple of front-end and data design tips. So as I've mentioned a couple of times already, use a common tool for data input. Excel is fantastic, but you have some other options. And you want to make sure, by the way, that you design the front end prior to the back end. Because, as I mentioned, you're going to ask yourself who will be tasked with using the framework to design the automated test. And in other things I've learned the hard way, don't assume that the users are experts in Excel. Don't take that for granted. In what format will the test be designed? You want to make sure that you utilize input, output, decision, and verification parameters. Also, incorporate simple keywords such as clear if the functionality is supposed to clear the content of a field, or maybe today plus 30 if you want to enter a date 30 days in the future. So these are all things. Make sure you incorporate simple keywords, much easier to learn, much easier to maintain. The last two, tips 6 and 7, on the back-end design on the next slide, make sure that you build the back-end to support the front end. Ask yourself, how does the data get fed into the framework? How does runtime data get captured and reused? How are multiple iterations handled? So these are all things that you want to ask yourself as you are designing the back end in order to support the front end. And then last, use good common sense coding best practices. Make sure that your engine, your drivers are all very modular in design. Make sure that they're well documented within the code itself. Ensure that your reporting is detailed, clear, and concise, maybe even getting screenshots if possible as objective evidence. So these are just 7 tips that I want to share with you. In the next slide, applying your framework, you want to initially start with getting to CI and continuous delivery. Start with automation of unit test. Automate your deployments to the stage environment as soon as possible. Another thing that you want to do is configure your continuous integration system to launch all tests based on an appropriate event. So that event might be a build, it might be a deployment, or it might be a specific time on a clock. And once you get to the point where you are releasing software on a daily basis, that's when you might be ready to look into continuous deployment, but make sure that the rest of your organization is ready as well. So I'm talking about documentation, support, marketing, because these functions will need to adapt to the new cadence of releases. And it's very important that they do not miss on significant changes that can impact customers. So that is it. And again, I apologize to everybody for that delay and really appreciate you sticking with us. But here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me anytime with any questions, any thoughts.